And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program in Washington, where trade talks have resumed between China and the U.S. The first face-to-face discussions in nearly 2 months kicked off on Thursday between deputy trade negotiators. They are expected to pave the way for higher-level meetings next month to resolve the 14-month trade war. Earlier, both sides made some concessions by suspending some planned tariffs in a sign of goodwill. Meanwhile, also in Washington, the U.S. Central Bank cut its key interest rate for the second time in more than a decade. Before we get down to our discussion about what all of this really means, let's take a look at this first.
Trade talks are back on between China and the U.S. This latest round sees deputy trade negotiators lay the groundwork for a high-level meeting in October. China's Vice Finance Minister Liao Min is leading the Chinese delegation of about 30 officials. Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Jeffrey Garish is head of Washington's team. The discussions are likely to focus on agriculture while also covering intellectual property rights. There has been a lifting of tensions earlier this month. First, China announced a list of American products that will be removed from the first round of additional tariffs. Then the U.S. delayed additional tariffs on imports from China that were due to be levied in October. And then China resumed its purchase of U.S. produce like soybean. During the past 14 months, the world's largest economies have put tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of each other's goods. The tensions have upended supply chains worldwide and curbed global economic growth. On Wednesday, the U.S. Central Bank cut its key interest rate to between 1.75% and 2%.
Trade policy tensions have waxed and waned, and elevated uncertainty is weighing on U.S. investment and exports. Our business contacts around the country have been telling us that uncertainty about trade policy has discouraged them from investing in their businesses.
The Fed also said it could cut rates even further if the trade war were to escalate. President Trump has pressured it to lower interest rates to accelerate growth. But this rate cut certainly wasn't enough. As Trump tweeted, Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve fail again.
For more on U.S.-China trade negotiations and the Federal Reserve interest rate cuts, we have in Shanghai Jimmy Zhu, Chief Strategist at Fullerton Research. Meanwhile, in Washington, we are joined by Joe Minarik, who is the Senior Vice President of the Committee for Economic Development. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Jacob Kirkgard, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Zhu, some suspension of tariffs from both sides. Good sign that there might be some kinds of at least a nice atmosphere to begin with. Mr. Zhu.
Yeah, I think the sentiment in the capital market is slightly more positive compared with the past few months. And even what we look at the economic data, actually, it shows that the market probably in the past few months is a bit too pessimistic. As what we see is the city economic surprise index is keep rising from the different regions. So that at least tells us the picture that, in the past few months, whether the pessimism on the trade talks our trade tension is too much. So moving forward, I don't think the trade deal can be reached in a very shortly, but for now, at least without any escalation at this moment is a good news for the market.
Good news for the market already. Status quo, Mr. Kirkgard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that the markets are perhaps beginning to price in a standstill. I don't think anybody seriously believes that there's going to be a major breakthrough in these trade talks anytime soon. But I do think at the same time people look at what's going on here in the United States and they recognize that President Trump needs better economic news as he heads into a re-election campaign. And if you look at the economic slowdown in China, as well as the upcoming 70th anniversary, the unrest in Hong Kong, I think it's pretty clear that the Chinese government as well has an interest in appearing to be in control, if you like, or having a process at least which, in the relationships with the United States.
both sides need something about the stability in the economy. Mr. Minarik, but political will or the political picture is only one thing, but the very important nature of this relationship has very much in the center of discussion over the past 2 years since the trade war broke out. So what about that?
We have a difficult environment. The United States and China, of course, newly established terms of engagement back in the 1990s. There have been concerns about the extent to which, here in the United States, there's concern about China's adherence to the rules. China has been concerned about the United States showing an absence of understanding of China's circumstances. The nature of the discussions is difficult because the issues that are on the table are very hard to govern. Enforcement of the rules is tricky. This is a difficult negotiation, unlike what we have seen in recent years.
Mr. Zhu, now, if it is as difficult as all of you have beautifully illustrated, that there has to be something to begin with, Mr. Zhu, what do you consider are some of the things right off the fingertip of the deputy trade negotiators to pave the way for at least a negotiation, formal one, at the very beginning of October, and both sides have claimed to the outside world? Mr. Zhu, what is at the fingertip right now, the issues?
I think for now it's probably we can't be, no one should be very ambitious on, everything should be solved in overnight. But at least now I see some positive signs is, the people from the two deputies side, actually they start to work on the partial deals. If there's some partial agreement can be made, things whether can solve slowly. And also the both sides actually need to understand thing is, the monetary policy, even the fiscal policy, those kind of a stimulus probably may not be able to solve all these troubles because, the people's confidence is not here. But at least if the process start to moving and then let the people see that, the escalations is gone and the things start to move into the normal levels, probably I think that's the best way to save the economy at this moment.
We're not talking about saving the economies yet because both sides still have some maneuvering ground. What I'm talking about, Mr. Zhu, if you can, is some of the issues that the fingertips of the deputy trade negotiators, that they at least could talk to one another, laying certain foundations for the eventual discussion, if there were any, in early October. Do you know anything, or do you think there's anything that they can, at this point, discuss?
There's some cultural difference, as earlier I hear, but I think from at this moment, when the both economy, are start to slow down, I think the very breaking through point is whether the two sides, can lift some tariff bans and the both sides actually start agree to buy some products from each other. I think that probably is the breaking point.
Okay, besides the suspension of the so-called threats of tariffs from one another on each other, what do you think, Mr. Kirkgard? What are some of the issues, immediate ones, that those sides can work on?
Well, I think basically what President Trump is looking for is a Chinese commitment to begin to buy more agricultural products. So they're basically looking for a dollar figure, preferably, of course, a large one. And clearly, on the Chinese side, I would imagine that the trade-off will be more tariff exemptions. We saw today that the Trump administration exempted, I believe, around 400 product categories for the new tariffs that were otherwise going to kick in later this year. I certainly believe that Beijing will be looking for more of those kinds of exemptions. So there is, in my opinion, a fairly straightforward trade-off of agriculture for exemptions, if you like, as an initial proprietary agreement, a small agreement, and then fundamentally the Trump administration will have to decide is it willing to take the political risk of striking a relatively narrow deal centered around tariffs and agricultural products with China and leaving the really difficult stuff aside? And by that I mean the issues surrounding Huawei, IPR, and other sort of technological issues. I don't think that decision is made yet, but that's certainly what I'll be looking at in the next, or looking for in the coming months.
Even though the ball can be in the court of the Trump administration, Mr. Millerick, on the other hand, the implementation of any deal, possible deal between the two sides, takes the implementation determination of both sides, and also certainly takes certain degree of trust at least. Now, both sides probably have to work hard in order to build that certain degree of trust. The Trump administration, no exception, given the previous issues, it seems that there is a lack of trust, particularly from Beijing toward Washington, about the immediate deals.
I believe that is true, and what we need, as you mentioned, there are substantive sides to these deals, and then there are questions of how they are implemented. The implementation part requires the United States having confidence and being willing to express that confidence in the willingness of China to comply. China has to believe that it is treated fairly and that the negotiations are at an appropriate level for two sovereign nations going together. That means that we're going to need an implementation process that allows some period of time for the demonstration of agreement and compliance with the agreement, and some fail-safe measures if it is determined that the agreement has not in fact been complied with. That's the tricky part, and putting those processes together is really a prerequisite for the two sides having enough confidence and trust that they would be willing to sign on.
But as you may know, Mr. Millerick, negotiators, what they can do is one thing. The other thing is about the jobs of the top leadership of both countries. Now, the trust between the two sides certainly have been exchanging some friendly remarks, but the eventual implementation of a deal takes really quite some degree of trust, even from the top leadership both sides. How will that be done on top of what the negotiators could do?
Well, the negotiators, of course, are talking at a technical level. They need to do their work well so that the foundation is built. But once that foundation is there, the leaders have to have confidence not only in the mechanisms but also in each other. One potential problem here is that the negotiations at the highest level seem to some extent have become personal. There's a sense that one side or the other will win, the other side will lose. That's not the essence of trade. The essence of trade is a voluntary agreement from both sides that both sides believe is in their interest. That's what trade is all about. That's right. I think we need a better recognition that we're trying to make commerce for the benefit of all, not to have an arm wrestling contest so that one can prove to be a winner.
Mr. Kirkgard, now, when it comes to the Trump administration, especially President Trump himself, there is both the necessity in terms of politics to reach a deal, a good deal, at least in the eyes of many of those who vote for him. On the other hand, there's also the vulnerability as a result of an election upcoming in your country. For example, you've been hearing so much about investigation about him, whistleblowers, the recent case about him or against him, now to mention some of the other issues related to him politically. So how vulnerable, if any, progress can be made in this trade negotiation when it comes to the President Trump's own political situation back at home and about the two parties' struggle, which is already spread out all over in your country right now?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that President Trump faces a daunting re-election campaign. It's far from certain that he will succeed. But I think this is really the core of the issue here, because ultimately, if you are China and you're looking at the previous behavior of President Trump, you see what happened to Mexico a couple of months ago. Mexico had a deal, trade deal, a renegotiated NAFTA with the United States, but woke up nonetheless one morning finding out that President Trump, for domestic political reasons, threatened them with ripping up that deal and imposing new tariffs on the border because of immigration. So if you're China, the basic question you have to ask is any deal that President Trump signs with you really worth it? Because, or is the risk that President Trump, as the election campaign heats up, is just basically going to rip it off for domestic political reasons, and you're back to square one? Because if it is the latter, then I believe that it is China's or President Xi's political interest not to necessarily go all out to strike a deal with President Trump, but merely to keep a sort of ceasefire and things from getting worse, and then basically waiting to see what happens in the election, and maybe he will be able to deal with another president come early 2021.
All right. But Mr. Zhu, obviously the Chinese side is still negotiating proactively. The Deputy Finance Minister going to Washington to lay the groundwork for possible early October negotiation is a sign of it. Now, how is China understand about the sophistication of the U.S. politics and also the vulnerability of any deal, if there will be any, under the current circumstances?
Right. That actually is I personally think it's the most tough part, because when we talk about the trade deal, but what I personally suspect is Trump is just treating this trade deal as a weapon, because his main purpose is not to improve the U.S. Trade balance, because what we see in the past few years or months, basically the U.S. trade deficits just keep go large and large. So the trade deal is the trade tension is definitely not helping. So the problem is, if Trump just used the trade deal as a weapon to ask China to compromise other things, then probably it will making the deal more difficult, because that probably will threaten the nation's interest.
Right, probably backfire on some of the other aspects of the bilateral relations as well, not to mention all the challenges the relations are already facing right now. Having said that, though, one of the important news we are having for this week, of course, the Fed interest rate cut. So what do you make of it, Mr. Minarek? It is rare that Fed has been doing that, and this time, for the second time already, quite close to one another between the two times. So what do you make of the Fed's decision? Is it more a political sign for U.S. internal consumption, or is it more a decision about the U.S. economy vis-a-vis those of the others?
The Federal Reserve has a reputation of being an impartial, public interest-oriented organization. And I wouldn't exaggerate the notion that these kinds of decisions are rare. The important thing to understand is that changes in interest rates by the Federal Reserve were fairly common. Then we had the financial crisis, and the reason why we haven't had changes since then is simply that interest rates needed to be made lower and kept low so that the economy would recover. The economy has now recovered fairly well, and we will go back to the previous regime of the earlier decades when interest rates are adjusted with some frequency as the economy needs it. Now, in terms of the political environment, I don't believe that the Federal Reserve is being political at all. I believe that what they are trying to do is to make appropriate economic decisions in an environment which is very unusual and very hard to predict. And that's why you see some of the internal discussions there.
You certainly see the unpredictability over there about the future of the economy worldwide. Mr. Kirkgard, now, despite of the fact that Federal Reserve want to remain apolitical, we have seen gestures coming from certain political leadership inside your country putting pressure of one kind or another, or influence, shall I say, on the Fed's decision. So what do you think now? Will Fed's nature, as a result of that, being challenged or questioned by the rest of the world? Even if its letter, the questioned part, is already making things ever more complicated on top of the reality we're already having. Mr. Kirkgard.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, the reality is that this is not the first time President Trump has directly challenged the Fed on monetary policy, but I think it'll backfire. When President Trump calls for a 200 basis point cut and back to zero immediately, there is actually a case for that. If you are totally focused on inflation expectations and recognize that the Fed has not met its 2% target consistently over the last 10 years, and therefore if you want a symmetric inflation target, you should actually be overshooting, you should have higher than 2% inflation at the moment, then you could make the case that the Fed should cut aggressively immediately. But President Trump calling for it openly clearly makes that case more difficult to make, because if the Fed were to follow this advice, then they would clearly be viewed as doing President Trump's political bidding, even though there are, if you like, fairly strong monetary policy reasons for doing so. So President Trump, in my opinion, as any political leader in the U.S. on monetary policy issues, missed a good opportunity to keep his mouth shut.
Well, before we go, gentlemen, people are looking at and looking for the results of the consultation between the deputy minister level going on right now. But what can we expect the realistic outcome of this consultation leading up to the early October, if there's going to be any negotiation on both sides? Let's go to you first, Mr. Minarik.
I expect that there will be a lot of consultation that will be highly technical, that will have to do with the verification and the remedies if there are any differences. Some of the policy issues, some of the substantive issues that need to be resolved are going to be very contentious. How do we look at U.S. allegations about Chinese use of intellectual property, and how do we deal with the role of state-owned enterprises in China? Those kinds of issues are going to be very, very difficult. You can come up with fair solutions at a ministerial level, but when they go to the principals level, those will require big decisions and major concessions on both sides if they are going to be resolved.
Mr. Kirkgard, briefly.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be, frankly, anything other than a straight-up quid pro quo, as I said earlier, agriculture for tariff exemptions, an agreement to have a de facto ceasefire at the moment. I personally don't believe that there is any particular willingness to revisit all the difficult technical issues that twice now we have thought we had a deal, only for it to be ripped off by the political level. I don't see the political space for a deal to be made on either side before the election.
All right, Mr. Zhu, finally, briefly.
I think things would be very challenging for any structural issue to be settled in the very near term. So from the market perspective and from the economic perspective, I think if the U.S. economy data released in the coming few weeks start to show the signs of weakening, then probably Trump will show some softening tone against the China tariff stuff.
Well, we'll see. A lot of things going on all at the same time. Jimmy Zhu, Joe Minerick, Jacob Kergard. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much for helping us understand your perspectives. Have a great weekend.